Has everyone been fed? I hear some yeses. My stomach's growling. I don't know if I can say yes to that today. But that question, has everyone been fed, is carved into the communion table at Black Mountain Presbyterian Church in Black Mountain, North Carolina. Has everyone been fed? Right there, right up front. In 2022, that church was wrestling with forming a new mission statement, not unfamiliar to what churches do, and they wanted this one to be something that they actually lived by, something that felt relevant and authentic, not just something they put together to throw on their website or put in a welcome brochure. And one of the committee members that was part of that group, initial group discerning what mission statements they might present to the congregation, pointed at the communion table and said, "What if it was that? Has everyone been fed?" And the group wondered, a question as a mission statement? They unpacked that question and they began to name all the ways that the church was feeding people, or at least tried to feed people in body, mind, and spirit. And they came to the conclusion that this question reminded them that their work is never finished and they can't become complacent. And so they presented it to the wider congregation and they decided to go with it. Now, in the Presbyterian world, it has to go to the presbytery, and there's a bunch of voting and passing and just all this bureaucratic institutional stuff that has to be taken care of for it to be the church's official mission statement. But they had it in front of them. Has everyone been fed? Fast forward 2 years. 2 years later, after their long approval process was finally complete, their pastor preached a sermon called "The Time Is Now," launching that new mission statement on September 22nd, 2024. And then 5 days later, Hurricane Helene came through and wreaked havoc on their small little mountain town and the surrounding areas of North Carolina. Lizel Gwynn Garrity, one of the creators of this Lenten series, Tell Me the Good News, tell me something good, grounding ourselves in the good news this Lent. Well, she's a member of that congregation. And she writes that she made her way to the church after the storm on foot, as nearly every road was impassable. She was hoping to check in on neighbors, make sure that everyone was okay, maybe gather some information about what was going on since all communication had shut off, and hopefully find some ice for her spoiling food. Ambitious goals. But when she arrived at the church, what she found was surprising. The church was already at work. Several members had emptied the entire pantry in the church's kitchen and freezer and refrigerator, and they were using gas-powered stoves to cook whatever they could. A line of people had already formed in the parking lot. They'd pulled out tables and folding chairs, and everyone was eating, and more people were waiting, and everyone was helping folks get what they needed. And she noticed their pastor, Mary Catherine, was moving through the crowd with a small little notepad, scribbling down what people needed: water, blankets, diapers, formula. And when she spotted Lizel, her pastor held up her little notepad And with a nervous smile, she said, "You can't even read my handwriting, can you?" And when someone worried about how they would wash all of these dishes for all of these people that they were serving, Pastor Mary Catherine looked around and she saw a trash can filled with some water, and she said, "Well, there's some rainwater there. A few French fries floating on top. That should work." There was no plan, no committee meeting, just people responding in the moment with willing hands and whatever they could find to share with one another. Within days, the church was feeding nearly 1,000 people a day. And people had heard about them, the church that responded, and donations were pouring in. Local restaurants were partnering with them to expand their food offerings. Volunteers showed up, some to serve, some to eat, most to do both. And as those supplies trickled in, and it took a while to get them there, because remember, those roads were unpassable. As supplies trickled in, the church's entire building was stuffed to the brim and served as a food pantry and a clothing closet. And over the following weeks and months, more than $2 million of donations came in and were distributed to support rebuilding and long-term recovery. Now, they had to form a committee to get those distributions to happen. Their mission statement, "Has everyone been fed?" is known far and wide by the community. And people still remember the church that acted quickly and started cooking. And to this day, after they share in communion, the pastor asks, "Has everyone been fed?" And the congregation shouts back, "Not yet." And they keep working towards that mission. You know, someone said to me this week that it's hard to think about good news, and it's hard to proclaim good news and sing good news when so much bad news and pain and violence surrounds us. And I understand that. It's not easy. Many of us, we are living in that tension right now. But that's actually the whole point of this worship series. The good news of God's love doesn't just appear when things are going well. The good news shows up in the middle of our toughest days and our darkest seasons, in places of deep pain and loss and uncertainty. And today's story, a beloved, familiar story to many, it reminds us that Jesus doesn't announce this good news from a distance. He invites us into the work of making it happen. Jesus looks at that crowd full of hungry people, and then he says to the disciples, "You feed them." And it's an impossible charge, right? And I just want to say, I'll confess, I understand the disciples here suggesting, okay, we only have a few loaves of bread and a couple of fish. I think it's best if we send these crowds away to make sure everyone gets fed. You know, sometimes my first instinct when someone proposes something bold is, okay, that's a great idea, but how are we going to pay for it? Right? Our finance committee is probably grateful that I pause and ask that question. But it's easy to get stuck in this mantra of this won't work because, instead of saying, let's see how we can make it happen. Let's see how we can happen. Do we have any Project Runway fans here? Anybody, a couple? Do you remember Tim Gunn, the host for several years? He would just say, make it work. Make it work. And that's what Jesus is saying to the disciples here. You know, feeding 5,000 people with 5 loaves and two fish, it's not just difficult, it is impossible unless the miracle was never meant to be performed by one person alone, right? Theologian Walter Brueggemann says that the Bible tells 2 competing stories about how the world works. One is the story of scarcity. Pharaoh, the voice of the empire, the voice that says there is not enough, so you better grab what you can and protect what's yours. It's the story that our culture tells us every single day. Work hard, buy more, secure your place, because there won't be enough. But the Bible begins with a different story altogether. A story of abundance. Genesis sings that creation is overflowing with life. The manna in the wilderness reminds us that God gives us enough for each day. And in this feeding of the multitudes, Jesus shows us what happens when fear loosens its grip and people begin working together and sharing what they have. 5 loaves and 2 fish become a feast. And the miracle is not just that the bread and the fish multiply. The miracle is that a community begins to trust God and one another. And trust that together, collectively, we have enough. The good news is that this crowd mobilizes into action. The good news is that the disciples' doubt doesn't stop what God is doing. The good news is that everyone is fed. One of my favorite quotes from Archbishop Desmond Tutu is, do your little bit of good where you are. Do your little bit of good where you are. It's those little bits of good put together that overwhelm our world. 5 loaves, 2 fish, a few people sharing what they had, and suddenly the impossible begins to shift. And I see glimpses of that happening at CCSM all the time. We see it in our sandwich ministry, where volunteers gather to prepare a simple sack lunch for neighbors who are hungry. We see it in our plate offerings and in speakers who come and share their story, like with Homework Central today, when we share what we can to support organizations that are doing vital work in our community, those gifts, break open and are shared just like that bread was. I see it when we do legal workshops and climate justice events, when we show up for pride celebrations and for housing justice at city council meetings. But I also see it in the quieter moments. I see it when someone makes a phone call or sends a card or drops by for a visit. Or shares a meal when someone's recovering from surgery. I see it when someone stops what they're doing to listen to someone else. Every one of those moments is another way the church answers that question: has everyone been fed? And today the answer is not yet, right? Not when people are still hungry. Not when our neighbors are still searching for safety and belonging. Not when people are still being kidnapped off the streets and when we bomb the streets of others. Not yet. And yet, every time we share what we have, every time we care for our neighbor, every time we choose compassion over fear, the answer moves a little closer to yes. Jesus didn't have a microphone in front of those crowds that day. He relied on people listening, sharing, and making sure that those around them were fed too. I remember my former boss during the pandemic used to say, "We are building the plane as we're flying it." And that's exactly what happened at Black Mountain Presbyterian. That's what the disciples are doing in today's story. We figure out the impossible together, one loaf of bread at a time, until we look back and we realize that feeding the multitudes was, in fact, possible. Our good news mantra this week is together we can make a difference. Say it with me. Together we can make a difference. Church, has everyone been fed?
Not yet.
Let's do it together. May it be so. Amen.